The cabin sat high on the slope of the mountain, built of thick-hewn logs and roofed with rough shingles that had weathered countless winters. Smoke rose thin from its chimney, curling into the frosty air before disappearing into the gray sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and iron. It was not the smell of a home, but of a man's shelter, a place stripped to its essentials. Elias, known only as the mountain man to those few who crossed his path, lived here in solitude. His days were shaped by silence, broken only by the sound of an axe striking wood, a rifle firing into the stillness of the trees, or the low growl of a river in thaw. He had chosen this life years ago, when grief and betrayal had driven him, away from towns and people. Out here there were no expectations, no gossip, no hearts to break or to break his. Only the rhythm of survival mattered. His cabin was sturdy, but inside it bore the mark of a man who cared little for comfort. A single table scarred with knife marks, a chair, a bunk with blankets rough and thin, and shelves lined with jars of dried beans, salted meat, and coffee grounds. The hearth, though large, rarely held a fire big enough to warm more than the immediate space. He saved his wood as though afraid it might run out, even with the forest pressing close against his. Elias himself was as rough-hewn as the logs of his home. Broad-shouldered, with a beard that often went untended and eyes that carried the gray weight of storm clouds, he moved with the quiet, deliberate strength of a man accustomed to labor. The years alone had hardened his manner. He spoke little, even to himself. Words, like kindness, felt wasted on an empty cabin, and yet beneath that gruff exterior, there was a reason for his isolation. Once, long ago, he had known family. He had been a son, a brother, even a man who dreamed of starting a family of his own. But tragedy had scattered those ties like dry leaves in the wind. Some he lost to illness, others to betrayal. The last wound, the one that sent him into the wilderness, was still too sharp to name aloud, even in the silence of the mountains. He told himself he had chosen this life, but often in the long hours of night, staring at the rafters, he wondered if the life had chosen him instead. Winter especially pressed hard upon him. The snow made game scarce, and the bitter cold gnawed at his joints. He was no longer young, though he pretended otherwise, and there were mornings when he woke with a cough that rattled in his chest, or a weariness that clung long after sunrise. His diet of dried venison and bitter coffee had stripped him of vigor, though pride forbade him to admit it. Still, Elias endured. Endurance was what he knew best. He cut his wood, set his traps, hunted what he could, and patched his roof when the storms tore shingles loose. But beneath it all was a quiet truth he dared not name. He was tired. Tired of the silence, tired of the sameness, tired of his body failing him. He had built this solitary fortress to protect himself from the world, but now the walls closed in on him like a prison. It was in this state, worn but unbroken, that the thought of hiring help first entered his mind. Not a companion, not someone to share his life, but simply a cook, someone who could prepare decent meals, maybe keep the cabin in better order, while he focused on the tasks of hunting and surviving. He convinced himself it was only practicality, nothing more. His pride told him he didn't need comfort, only sustenance. His heart told him to remain locked behind its walls. But somewhere deep inside, in the quiet place he refused to look too closely at, there stirred a hunger that had nothing to do with food, a hunger for warmth. Not just the heat of a fire, but the warmth of another presence. A hunger for a voice that did not belong to the wind or the echo of his own. Still, Elias pushed the thought aside. He was a mountain man, after all, and mountain men did not admit to such weakness. He would hire a cook because his health required it. Nothing more, nothing less. At least, that is what he told himself as he stared into the thin smoke curling from his hearth, never guessing how that Clara, pressed a hand to her back as she walked along the muddy road leading out of town, her steps slow but steady despite the weight she carried. Her belly, round with child, shifted beneath her faded dress, and every so often a sharp ache reminded her that she was not only traveling for herself, but for the life within her. Each step forward was driven not by strength alone, but by desperation. Only. Months ago, Clara had been a wife. The memory of her husband still lingered, his laughter, his promises, his dreams for their family. But his life had been cut short, snatched away in a logging accident that left her not only widowed, but penniless. He had worked hard, yes, but the little wages he earned were swallowed quickly by debts and the cost of living. When he died, Clara was left with nothing but grief, a child on the way, and a town that had little kindness to spare for a woman in her condition. At first, she tried to manage on her own. She took in mending work, sewing by the dim light of an oil lamp long after her body begged for rest. She swallowed her pride to clean houses for women who barely acknowledged her beyond handing over a broom. But with her condition advancing, those small jobs began to slip away. Employers frowned at her swelling belly and muttered that she should be at home, not dragging herself through work. They didn't understand that home was not a refuge. It was a half-empty pantry and a roof she could barely keep over her head. The gossip was worst of all. In a small town, news traveled quickly, and pity was often laced with scorn. "Poor thing," they whispered, "won't last the winter." Some suggested she remarry quickly, as though a woman could barter her grief for bread. Others avoided her altogether, fearing the burden of charity. Clara, proud and weary, tried not to let their words wound her, but at night she lay awake listening to the silence press in around her, feeling the flutter of her child and wondering how she could bring it into such an unforgiving world. It was then that the offer came. A trader passing through town mentioned a mountain man, strange, rough, but willing to pay someone willing to cook and keep his cabin. Most women in town dismissed the idea with laughter. Who would travel into the wilderness heavy with child to work for a man like that? But for Clara, it was not foolishness. It was a chance. She had no illusions that it would be easy. The mountains were harsh, the man reputedly harsher. But the thought of steady meals, of shelter through the coming winter, and of earning even a small wage for her child's future was enough to harden her resolve. She knew what people thought when she made her decision. Desperate, they said. Mad, some whispered. And perhaps she was both. But desperation had become her closest companion, and madness was a lesser price than starvation. Clara gathered what little she had: a threadbare shawl, a worn satchel with 2 changes of clothes, and the quilt her mother had sewn for her before she passed. That quilt was the only softness left in Clara's life, and she folded it carefully, as though it were a treasure. On the morning she left, she stood for a long while in front of the small cottage she had once shared with her husband. Its shutters sagged, and the yard was overgrown. It had been their dream to fix it together, to make it a place where children could run and laughter could echo. Now it was nothing but an empty shell. Clara touched the doorframe once, whispered a goodbye to a life she would never have, and turned away. The road to the mountains was not kind. Rain slicked the dirt and turned it into ruts. Her shoes, already worn thin, grew heavier with each mile. People she passed gave her curious or pitying glances, but no one stopped her. She didn't expect them to. She had long since learned that sympathy rarely stretched into action. What sustained her was not comfort or hope, but sheer will. She thought of the child she carried, the tiny life that kicked against her ribs, reminding her that she was not alone. She whispered promises to it when the ache grew sharp. "I'll find us a place. I'll keep you safe. We'll have food. You'll have a chance." By the time the jagged outline of the mountains came into view, Clara's body throbbed with fatigue, but her spirit held. The mountain man's cabin lay somewhere in those ridges, hidden among pines and snow. She did not know what awaited her there, a gruff master, perhaps, or endless toil, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would endure it. She had to. For herself, yes. But more than that. For the child who would soon depend on her for everything. That was how Clara, a proud but desperate widow heavy with child, began the journey that would carry her into the life of a man who thought he needed only a cook, and into a story neither of them could yet imagine. The sun was sinking behind the ridges when Clara finally spotted the cabin. From a distance, it looked like part of the mountain itself, rough logs darkened with weather, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, the whole structure crouched low against the wind. She paused at the tree line, one hand steadying her back, the other clutching the strap of her satchel. Her breath caught, not from the climb, but from the weight of the unknown. She had imagined this moment on the long road up, the man himself, the cabin, what sort of welcome or dismissal might await her. Yet all her imagining hadn't prepared her for the jolt of nerves as she finally stepped onto the clearing's edge. The door opened before she could knock. He filled the frame, tall and broad, shoulders squared as though braced for a fight. His beard was thick, his hair unkempt, and his eyes, steel gray and unyielding, studied her with the sharpness of a hawk measuring distance to prey. Clara felt her heart stutter, but she lifted her chin. She had faced harder stares in town, where pity and disdain hid behind false smiles. "You're the one they sent?" His voice was gravel rough, low and suspicious, as though the very idea of her presence had offended him. "I'm Clara," she said evenly, refusing to let the tremor in her chest touch her words. "I was told you needed someone to cook." She shifted slightly, her hand resting unconsciously against her belly. "I can do that. And more, if needed." His eyes flicked down to her swollen middle and back up, his frown deepening. "They didn't say you were carrying." The word fell from his mouth like a stone. Clara's jaw tightened. "If that changes your mind, say so now. I won't beg." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The cold wind cut across the clearing, tugging at her shawl, but she held his gaze. Elias, though she didn't know his name yet, measured her as though weighing her against the cost of wood, meat, and space. She looked fragile, yes, but there was a set to her shoulders that suggested steel beneath the weariness. At last he stepped aside. "Come in, then. We'll try it for a spell." The cabin's interior was much as she had feared. Bare walls, a rough-hewn table, a cot in the corner, and shelves stacked with jars of beans and dried meat. The hearth was cold, a pot still crusted from the last meal. It was a place of survival, not living. "You'll cook. Keep the place in order," he said, shutting the door behind her with a thud. "That's it. I'm not looking for chatter or fuss." Clara set her satchel down carefully. "I'm not here to fuss. I need work. You need meals. That's the agreement." He grunted, as though her bluntness surprised him. "And when the time comes, when that child comes—" "I don't, midwife." She met his gaze squarely. "I don't expect you to. I've managed on my own this far. I'll manage then." She swallowed, her voice softening. "But until that time, I can keep your table warm. You'll eat better than dried meat and burnt coffee, at least." A flicker, was it amusement or disbelief, passed across his face. He didn't smile, but his mouth twitched as if fighting the thought. "We'll see." Their agreement was as simple as the mountain itself, drawn in hard lines and cold words. Yet even in that first exchange, there was a tension that ran deeper than work. Clara felt it when she began moving about the cabin, tidying the neglected corners, laying out what little provisions there were as though to coax them into order. She felt his eyes on her, wary but curious, measuring her every step. Elias felt it too. He had expected some meek woman, desperate enough to trade obedience for shelter. Instead, he found someone who refused to shrink before him, even swollen with child and weariness. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By the time darkness fell, the hearth glowed with a new fire, and the smell of stew filled the cabin. Beans, softened, meat simmering with herbs Clara had carried from town in a small pouch. It wasn't much, but it was more than Elias had tasted in months. He sat at the table, silent, while she ladled food into 2 bowls. When she finally sat opposite him, the firelight catching her tired but determined face, he spoke again, his tone rough but less sharp. "This'll be temporary. You work, you stay. You don't, you go. That's all there is." Clara lifted her spoon, nodded once, and said, "Fair enough." And so the uneasy agreement was struck, not written on paper, not sealed by handshake, but forged in necessity, in hunger, and in the unspoken truth that both of them carried more burdens than they were willing to share. Neither guessed, as they ate in silence, that this cold contract would soon unravel into something far warmer, something that neither solitude nor sorrow could keep at bay. The first week in the cabin was a quiet test of wills. Elias kept to his routine, chopping wood at dawn, setting his traps, tending to repairs around the cabin, and Clara slipped into her tasks, sweeping the floors, scrubbing dishes left too long, and cooking meals with what meager supplies she had to work with. On the surface, they were managing, but beneath the silence, friction smoldered. It began with the meals. Elias had lived too long on a diet of dried venison, beans, and bitter coffee. Food was fuel to him, nothing more. When Clara set down a steaming pot of stew with a sprinkle of herbs and a heel of bread she'd baked from scratch, he eyed it with suspicion, as though her effort was frivolous. "You spent near half the flour on this?" he grumbled, spoon in hand. Clara, bone-tired from kneading dough on an aching back, looked up sharply. "We needed bread. You've enough flour for weeks. Better to use it than let it sit and grow stale." "It's waste," he muttered, though he took a second helping before the pot cooled. She didn't miss the contradiction, but she bit her tongue. If he wanted to pretend he disapproved, let him. She had no intention of living on tough meat and scorched beans when she could make more of what little they had. The next clash came over the cabin itself. Clara had always believed that a place, no matter how humble, should feel like a home. She opened the shuttered window to let in light, folded her quilt over the chair, and even tucked wildflowers into a tin cup on the table. Small things, but to her they mattered. Elias noticed immediately. Returning from chopping wood, he frowned at the flowers as if they were weeds invading his space. "What's this for?" "They make the room less dreary," Clara replied simply, brushing sawdust from his coat where he'd left it carelessly on the table. "This isn't a parlor," he said, pulling the coat back. "No sense in fussing with frills. Cabin's meant to stand, not to charm." Clara met his eyes, her tone calm but steady. "A cabin can stand and still feel alive. You've been living like a ghost in a tomb." That earned her a dark glare. For a moment she thought he might order her out then and there, but he only stalked to the hearth, crouched by the fire, and muttered something she couldn't catch. Yet the hardest quarrel was silence itself. Elias cherished it. To him, silence was a shield against memory. Clara, though, found silence unbearable. It reminded her of her empty cottage after her husband's death, of the nights when grief pressed in with no sound but her own heartbeat. So she hummed, softly at first, as she cooked or swept, small tunes her mother once sang while working. The notes were simple, low, but warm. The first time Elias heard it, he froze. The melody drifted into the air, filling spaces that had long been void. His jaw tightened. Stop that." "Stop what?" she asked, turning from the hearth with a spoon in hand. "That noise." Clara blinked, surprised. "You mean the humming?" "It's not noise, it's just habit." "It's racket," he snapped. "I don't need it." Her brows lifted, and for the first time since arriving, her patience frayed. "Racket? If you call a little tune racket, I pity the crows outside. At least they sing without someone growling at them." He shot her a look, but she did not flinch. Something in her tone, exhausted, sharp, yet not cruel, held him back from further words. He turned instead to the door, muttering, "Suit yourself. Just don't expect me to like it." The door slammed behind him, and Clara stood for a moment in the sudden hush. Anger stirred hot in her chest, but beneath it, pity too. What kind of life had he lived, that even a bit of humming felt like an intrusion? That night, when Elias returned, the cabin smelled of rabbit stew, thick with herbs. He sat at the table, stiff-backed, not looking at her. She hummed no tune this time, out of courtesy, but her silence was different from his. Hers carried weight, while his carried walls. The days rolled on in that uneasy rhythm, her warmth brushing against his resistance, her small comforts chafing, his sense of order. Each clash left marks not of hatred, but of two strong wills, learning where the other's edges lay. And though Elias would never admit it aloud, when he found the flowers replaced with fresh ones, or a song rising on Clara's lips, despite his protests, he felt something stir. It wasn't anger, though he told himself it was. It was the uncomfortable awareness that her presence was changing the cabin, and perhaps in time it might change him as well. For now, though, all he could do was scowl at her bread, grumble at her flowers, and growl at her humming. And all she could do was keep at it, quietly determined, unwilling to let the mountain's silence swallow her as it had swallowed him. By the time the first frost clung to the pines outside, Clara's presence had become a fact of Elias's days, like the smoke in the chimney or the axe leaning against the porch rail. He still kept his walls high, still grumbled at her changes, to his routines, but he no longer pretended she was a passing nuisance. She was here. She had settled into the cabin with a quiet, steady rhythm, and for better or worse she could not be ignored. What Elias did try to ignore, though, was the growing swell of her belly. At first, when she arrived, it had been easy to look past. She had carried herself with such firm dignity that it was possible to see her as just another worker, someone brought into his solitude by necessity. But now, as the weeks moved on, her condition could not be hidden. Her belly pressed against the fabric of her dress. Her steps grew slower, and her face sometimes paled when she rose too quickly. Elias caught himself watching. He didn't mean to. His eyes were simply drawn. He would see her pause in her work, one hand resting protectively over her middle, her other hand braced against the table as though steadying not just herself, but the life inside her. There was a softness in those moments that unsettled him. At night, lying on his cot, Elias found his thoughts circling where he did not want them to go. He remembered his own past, fragments he had buried deep. Once, long ago, he too had dreamed of children. He had imagined a cabin, not unlike this one, but filled with laughter, with small feet running across the floor, with the warmth of family that could drive back even the hardest winter. That dream had died with loss, and he had sworn never to reopen that wound, but Clara's presence reopened it all the same. Her child, unborn, unseen, was a living reminder of what he had lost. And yet, instead of bitterness, Elias felt something stranger, a tug he could not name. The first time it truly broke through was one morning when he returned from checking his traps. Clara was outside, kneeling by the woodpile, awkwardly stacking kindling. Her back was bent, her face pale, but she was stubbornly determined. "What in blazes are you doing?" Elias barked, striding forward. She looked up. strands of hair escaping, her shawl. "The pile was low. You'll need more for tonight." "You've no business lifting wood in your state," he growled, setting down his traps. "You'll wear yourself out, or worse." Her lips thinned. "I'm not helpless, Elias. I've been working since I was a girl. Carrying a child doesn't mean I can't carry wood." He stopped, torn between anger and something far more vulnerable. He opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again, unsettled. The way she said it, firm, unyielding, yet weary, reminded him that she had been surviving. Alone before she ever came here, she had no luxury of rest, only the necessity of pushing forward. "Still," he muttered, softer now, "there's no need for you to do it while I'm here." And before she could protest, he stooped to gather the wood himself, stacking it with sharp, efficient motions. She watched him silently, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, something almost like truce. From then on, Elias began to notice her weariness more keenly. He saw the way she sometimes sat longer by the fire after supper, her hands folded over her belly, her eyes distant. He noticed the quiet grimace when she rose from her chair, the way her steps slowed as evening came. He found himself adjusting without realizing, splitting more wood than usual, carrying heavier loads from the traps, even leaving small chores undone so she wouldn't feel compelled to finish them. Clara, for her part, did not speak of her struggle. Pride and necessity had taught her to endure in silence. But she noticed Elias's subtle shifts. When she found the woodpile fuller than she'd left it, or the bucket already drawn from the well, she said nothing. Yet in her heart, something softened toward him, though she knew better than to name it hope. The child's shadow fell over their every exchange. Sometimes, when Clara rested her hand over her belly, Elias's gaze flicked there, his expression unreadable. Once, when a faint kick made her gasp and smile faintly to herself, Elias startled as though he'd heard it too, though he quickly turned away. The distance between them had not closed, but it had changed. No longer was Clara just a cook, and no longer was Elias able to pretend she was merely passing through. The life inside her had bound her to the cabin in a way neither of them could deny, and in the stillness of night, as the fire dimmed and the mountain winds howled, Elias sometimes found himself listening, not to silence, but to the sound of her slow, even breathing, and the faint rustle when she shifted in her sleep. It stirred something inside him, something half-buried yet stubborn, whispering of family, of warmth, of grace. He clenched his fists against it, reminding himself he was a man alone. But the truth remained, as certain as the snow on the peaks. The child's shadow had fallen, the storm rolled, in without warning, sweeping down the mountain with a ferocity that even Elias had not anticipated. One moment the air was still, the sky heavy with gray, and the next the wind howled like a beast, rattling the shutters and driving sheets of snow against the cabin walls. By nightfall, the cabin was sealed in a cocoon of white. The wind whistled through the cracks between the logs, and every gust pressed against the walls as though testing their strength. Elias paced the floor, the storm igniting a restlessness in him. He was used to storms, but this one felt different, heavier. Supplies were low. He had underestimated the severity of the early cold, and Clara's presence made every calculation sharper. Clara sat near the hearth, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, hands folded over her belly. The baby stirred within her, and she rubbed small circles absently as she watched the firelight dance. The flames warmed her face, but worry pinched her brow. She had weathered storms before, but never in the wilderness, never in a cabin so far from help. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was edged with tension. "Wood won't last if the wind keeps up like this. We'll need to ration." Clara looked up, her eyes steady. "We'll manage. You've faced storms before." "Not with two mouths to feed," he muttered, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. And soon to be 3. The words slipped out, more raw than he intended. Clara's eyes softened, though she said nothing at first. The acknowledgement that he counted her child in his reckoning was the first time he'd spoken of the baby as anything but a burden. The storm raged on, howling like wolves at the door. The shutters rattled, and snow forced its way in through the smallest gaps. Elias cursed under his breath as he stuffed rags into the cracks, while Clara quietly rose and began folding her quilt around the draftiest seams. He turned to stop her, to tell her to sit, but the sight of her bent over with determination caught him short. He said nothing, only moved beside her to help. When the worst gusts passed, they settled by the fire. Elias leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching the flames. Clara cradled a mug of thin broth, sipping slowly. For a while, the only sound was the storm's muffled roar. Then Clara spoke, her voice low but clear. "I used to be afraid of storms as a girl. My mother would sit beside me, tell me the thunder was only heaven's drums keeping time. She made me believe it was something grand instead of something to fear." Elias glanced at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. "And now?" She smiled faintly, though it held no humor. "Now I fear silence more than storms. Silence means there's no one left to fill it." The word struck deeper than she knew. Elias looked away, jaw tightening. Silence had been his shield for years, but in that moment, he saw it through her. Eyes, lonely, heavy, suffocating. Clara sipped her broth again, then set it aside. "You keep yourself locked away in it, Elias. Like the silence is a friend, but it isn't. It eats at you." His head snapped toward her, bristling at her boldness. "And what would you know about what eats at me?" She didn't flinch. "I know grief. I know loss. I know what it is to carry pain so heavy you think no one else can bear it. You think if you keep it inside, you can control it. But all it does is harden you until there's nothing left but stone." Her words silenced him more effectively than any argument. He stared at the fire, at the way the flames licked upward and died back again, like the heart beating in a chest, too tired to fight. After a long pause, his voice came low, grudging. "You talk too much." She gave a soft laugh, unexpected in the tense air. "Someone has to." For the first time in years, Elias felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close enough that it startled him. He buried it quickly, rising to toss another log on the fire. The night wore on. The storm battered the cabin, testing their walls, their supplies, their patience. But inside, something else shifted. Elias found himself listening, not just to the storm, but to her steady breathing beside the fire. And Clara, despite her exhaustion, felt less alone than she had in months. When dawn finally broke, the storm had blanketed the world in white, silence. But inside the cabin, between the crackling fire and the warmth of shared hardship, that silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the pause between words. Waiting, expectant, alive. Len across his life, and there was no turning back. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. Snow lay heavy on the pines, branches bending under the weight, and the air outside the cabin was bitter and sharp. Inside, though, the hearth glowed steadily, a hard-won fire that Clara tended with care. The storm had forced them into closer quarters, and something between them had shifted, barely perceptible but real. Elias felt it most in the silence. It was no longer the hollow, suffocating silence he had grown accustomed to. It was layered now with the presence of another heartbeat, another breath, another will strong enough to push back against his own. He didn't know whether to resent it or to lean into it, and so he did what came easiest. He bristled. The morning after the storm, Clara moved about the cabin with her usual quiet purpose, humming as she kneaded dough. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hands dusted with flour, and a strand of hair had come loose across her cheek. Elias sat at the table, sharpening his knife, the scrape of steel on stone filling the room. He watched her for a while without speaking, the rhythm of her humming needling him more than he wanted to admit. Finally, he muttered, "Don't know how you find breath to sing when there's work to be done?" Clara didn't pause in her kneading. "Singing helps me do the work. It's a distraction," he said flatly, testing the knife's edge. She glanced at him then, her eyes calm but steady. From what? The question unsettled him. He had no answer, at least not one he was willing to give. He scowled, setting the knife down harder than necessary. "You think you know everything, don't you? You act as though humming and flowers and bread are enough to fix a world that doesn't care if you live or die." Her hands stilled on the dough. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him fully. "You're right," she said softly. "The world doesn't care. It never has. But people can. We can. And if all I can give is bread and a song and a bit of beauty in a place that's forgotten it, then I'll give it. Because bitterness doesn't feed a soul, Elias. It starves it." Her words struck him harder than any blade could. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words withered before they reached his tongue. Her gaze was unwavering, not harsh, but full, of a quiet fire. "You think hardness keeps you alive?" she continued, her voice steady. "But it's killing you piece by piece. I've seen it before, in men who lost too much and refused to open their hearts again. They built walls so high they forgot what they were keeping out." "Grace," she said, her hand resting lightly against her belly, "is what saves us. Not strength, not silence. Grace." Elias stared at her, his chest tight. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that grace had no place in a world of loss, but he couldn't. Not when she stood before him, weary yet unbroken, carrying a child she refused to despair over. His voice, when it came, was rough, almost hoarse. "You don't know what I've lost." "No," Clara admitted gently. "But I know what I've lost, and I know what it costs to keep living after. The difference between us is, I choose not to let it turn me to stone." The words sank into the quiet that followed. Elias felt them settle in places he had long thought dead. He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused, and for the first. The days after Clara's quiet rebuke carried a different rhythm. Elias still moved with his usual blunt efficiency, splitting wood at dawn, checking traps at midday, shoveling snow when the paths became too heavy. But something in his manner had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, not even to him, but Clara noticed. His silences were no longer laced with the same hostility, and when his eyes lingered on her, they carried less suspicion and more curiosity. Winter deepened, wrapping the mountain in white silence. Food was harder to come by, chores heavier, and Clara's body slower with each passing week. She never complained, though her steps had grown more careful, her breaths shallower. One morning, when she bent to lift a heavy pot from the hearth, Elias was suddenly beside her, his hand closing firmly around the handle before she could protest. "You'll strain yourself," he said gruffly, setting the pot on the table. Clara blinked, surprised. "I've been lifting pots since I was 10. "Not with a child pressing on your spine." The words were sharper than he intended, but the concern beneath them was unmistakable. Clara studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "So you do notice." He muttered something under his breath, busying himself with the fire. But the truth was, he noticed everything now, the way she shifted her weight to ease the ache in her back, the time she grew quiet with fatigue, the absent circles she rubbed over her belly. Where once he would have looked away, now he found himself watching, restless with the need to ease burdens he didn't know how to touch. That night, as the wind moaned outside, Elias laid out an extra quilt over her bed. Clara's eyes opened when she felt the weight settle over her. "You'll freeze without it," she whispered. "I've seen colder nights." His tone was dismissive, but his hand lingered a second too long on the edge of the quilt before he pulled back. The following day, when he returned from checking snares, he set down a bundle of meat on the table. Clara reached for it, but he held up a hand. "I'll cut it. You sit." She tilted her head at him, amused. "Since when does the mountain man take orders from a widow?" Since she doesn't know when to rest. For the first time, Clara laughed freely, the sound light and warm, filling corners of the cabin that had long known only echoes. Elias looked away quickly, but his ears burned. As the weeks went on, his acts of care grew less clumsy. He fetched extra wood without her asking. He checked the shutters at night so the drafts wouldn't chill her. When her shoes grew too tight from swelling, he found scraps of hide and fashioned softer slippers by the fire, grumbling the entire time but handing them to her with an awkward, "These'll do." Clara accepted them gently, her smile lingering as she slipped them on. "Thank you, Elias. They're perfect." The simple gratitude struck him like a blow. It had been years since anyone had thanked him for anything, not for survival, not for labor, not for the bone-deep endurance he had carried alone. And here was this woman, weary and expectant, teaching him that grace could exist even in the smallest exchanges. One evening, as she hummed while mending a shirt of his, Elias finally asked, "Why do you do that? Humming, singing. You don't even know if the child will live to hear it." Clara paused, needle poised in her hand. Her eyes lifted to his, steady and unflinching. "Because if he does live, I want him to know joy was part of his beginning. Not just fear, not just survival, even if it's only me humming over a threadbare shirt." The words pierced Elias deeper than he let on. For the rest of the night he sat by the fire, pretending to work on his traps, but his gaze kept drifting toward her, to the glow of the lamplight softening her tired face. He thought of the walls he had built, of the silence he had worshipped, and for the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps those walls had not been protecting him, but imprisoning him. When he finally rose to bank the fire, he paused, looking at Clara where she sat stitching quietly, her belly rounding beneath her hands. "You've got more grit than any man I've known," he said roughly. She looked up, startled. Then her lips curved into a slow smile. "And you've got more kindness than you let yourself believe." The words left him raw, unsteady. He turned quickly to the hearth, hiding the unfamiliar heat rising in his chest. But inside, he knew something undeniable. The mountain man who had once lived only for himself was no longer the same. Clara was changing him, not with force, not with demands, but with grace, and he was beginning, slowly, to let her. The mountain was silent that night, a silence thick enough to press against the cabin walls. Outside, the snow glittered under a pale moon, and the trees stood like sentinels. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing shadows that wavered against the rough-hewn beams. Clara stirred restlessly in her bed, her hand pressed against her belly, her breathing uneven. At first, Elias thought it was another night of discomfort. She had grown heavy with the child, her steps slower, her nights longer. But when she let out a low, strained groan, his head snapped up from where he was mending a trap. "What is it?" His voice was rough, urgent, her face tightened with pain. "It's starting, Elias." The words sent a jolt through him. He froze, trap in hand, as if the world had tilted. He knew how to build fires in the rain, how to face down wolves, how to survive winters that would kill lesser men. But this was something he could not fight with muscle or steel. "Now?" he asked, almost foolishly. Yes, Clara hissed, gripping the edge of the quilt as another wave of pain gripped her. The baby's coming. For a moment he stood there, useless, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then instinct broke through his fear. He dropped the trap and moved to her side, kneeling awkwardly. Tell me what to do. Her eyes, though, clouded with pain, met his. Keep the fire strong. Boil water. I'll need clean cloths, whatever you can find. He was on his feet before she finished, hauling wood to the hearth, the flames leaping higher under his frantic hands. He filled the pot, setting it over the fire, then dug through the chest for strips of linen. His movements were clumsy, frantic, but his purpose was clear. When he returned to her side, she was sweating, her breath coming in short gasps. She clutched his hand without warning, her grip iron strong. Elias flinched, not from the pain, but from the surge of something unfamiliar. His life, his steadiness, suddenly tethered to hers. You'll be all right, he muttered, though his own voice shook. I won't let anything happen. Clara gave a strained laugh between contractions. It's not you who decides, Elias. He swallowed hard. He knew she was right. Life and death in childbirth were beyond his control. But the thought of losing her, of the cabin falling back into that hollow silence, was unbearable. Hours passed like an eternity. Clara labored, her strength tested in ways that humbled even Elias. She bore the pain with grit, teeth clenched, her voice breaking, only in moments when the waves of agony became too much. Elias stayed at her side, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement in his halting, awkward way. He had never prayed in years, but as he held her hand through the worst of it, his lips moved with desperate, broken whispers. Pleas to a God he wasn't sure was listening. You're doing it, he told her fiercely as she cried out, her body trembling. You're the strongest soul I've ever seen. Just a little longer, Clara. Just a little. At last, after one final cry that tore. From her throat like a battle cry, the cabin was filled with a new sound, a wail, sharp and insistent. Elias froze, the breath leaving him in a rush. The child was here. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face, half from exhaustion, half from relief. Elias, trembling as though he had faced down a bear, lifted the tiny, wriggling bundle with hands that had only ever known weapons and work. The child's skin was warm, slick, and impossibly fragile. He wrapped it in the linen and placed it gently in Clara's arms. Her eyes softened instantly, gazing down at the newborn with wonder. A boy, she whispered. Elias, it's a boy. Elias knelt beside her, staring in awe. The cabin seemed transformed, every shadow driven away by the sound of that small, defiant cry. He reached out a hand, hesitant, and brushed one finger against the child's cheek. The baby turned instinctively, his tiny mouth searching. Something inside Elias broke open then, something he hadn't known was still there. A well of tenderness, fierce and overwhelming, surged through him. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. Clara looked up at him, her face pale but radiant. We made it, she whispered. For once, Elias couldn't hide behind gruffness or silence. His voice cracked as he answered, No, you made it. You and him. He broke off, shaking his head, unable to speak through the storm in his chest. Clara squeezed his hand weakly. No, Elias, we made it together. And in that moment, he knew she was right. For the first time in years, he hadn't carried the weight alone. He had shared it, messy, terrifying, and miraculous as it was, and the world felt less empty because of it. Morning broke soft and quiet over the mountains, the pale sun spilling across snow-laden pines. The storm of the night before had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a crisp stillness, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Inside the cabin, however, life stirred anew. Elias sat near the hearth, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes fixed on the sight before him. Clara, lying against the quilts, her hair damp and tangled, but her face peaceful as she held, the newborn close to her breast. The fire's glow painted them in gold and amber, like something out of a dream. He had faced storms, wild animals, hunger and loneliness, but nothing had ever undone him the way that tiny cry had last night. The baby had pulled something loose inside him, unraveling knots he hadn't known were still binding his soul. He could still hear the echo of it in his chest, steady and insistent, reminding him that life, fragile and beautiful, had chosen to take root here in his cabin, in his care. Clara's eyes fluttered open. She caught him staring, and for a moment they simply looked at one another. No words were needed. Everything had been spoken in sweat, fear, and tears through the long night. But still, she whispered softly, "You stayed." The simplicity of it struck him harder than any accusation or praise. He swallowed, shifting awkwardly, as if words might betray the weight of what he felt. "I told you I wouldn't let anything happen. His voice faltered, thick. "I couldn't leave you, Clara. Not now. Not ever." Her smile trembled, tender and knowing. "You saved us, Elias. Both of us." She lowered her gaze to the child, who nestled against her, quiet for the moment, as though listening to their voices. Elias leaned forward, his large, calloused hand hesitantly brushing the baby's tiny fist. The child's skin was soft, impossibly delicate against his scarred fingers. When the infant's hand curled instinctively around his finger, Elias let out a shaky breath. A man who had believed his life long emptied of meaning suddenly felt tethered to something greater than himself. For years, he had lived as though the world owed him nothing, and he owed the world even less. He had been content to withdraw into the silence of the mountains, convinced that solitude was safer than hope. But now, looking at Clara and the newborn, he realized how wrong he had been. Safety was not living, and love, even the fragile, frightening beginnings of it, was worth every risk. The hours slipped by slowly that day. Elias busied himself as best he could, stoking the fire, fixing broth, keeping the cabin warm. Yet every task drew his gaze back to Clara and the child. He caught himself softening, smiling even, as the baby squirmed and cooed. The sound of new life filled corners of the cabin once haunted by silence. At one point, Clara shifted, trying to rise. Elias was at her side in an instant, steadying her. "Don't you dare," he muttered, though his tone was gentler than it had ever been. "You just brought a child into this world. Rest." She laughed softly, leaning back. "You're fussing like an old hen." "Maybe," Elias admitted, the corner of his mouth twitching. "But I reckon you've earned it." That night, as the baby slept between them in a little cradle Elias had cobbled together in haste, the two adults sat close by the fire. The warmth wrapped around them, and for the first time, silence felt comfortable. No longer empty, but shared. Clara turned her head, studying him with quiet curiosity. "You've changed, Elias," she said finally. He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Maybe I just remembered what I lost, what I pushed away. You and him. You brought it back, Grace." He turned to her then, his voice raw with truth. "I thought I was done with it, Clara, done with life, with hope. But you've shown me it isn't gone. Not if I choose to hold on." Tears shimmered in her eyes, though she smiled. "And I thought I'd never find a place to belong again. But maybe we both were wrong." Elias reached across the space between them, his hand enveloping hers. The fire crackled. The child stirred softly, and the cabin felt more alive than it ever had. The mountain man who once sought only solitude now sat with a family he had never expected. His heart no longer hardened, but opened by the quiet strength of a widow and the cry of a newborn. In them, he had not only found companionship, but also redemption. And so, beneath the watch of the endless mountains, Elias finally understood. Strength was not in walls built high or hearts kept guarded, but in the grace of love freely given and in the courage to accept it.